What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So it's not technically an off week for the UFC, but it might as well be because the card sucks this weekend. So rather than cover any of those fights, I thought I would do a topic video, and that topic is fighters' primes. Like, what is a prime? When is someone past their prime? Like, what do I look at in order to assess whether someone's past their prime? And why does it seem like fighters' primes are lasting longer now than they used to in the past? Because I talk a lot about people's primes. Like, anytime I'm talking about GOAT status and legacy and stuff like that, when I'm looking at people's resumes, I often look at the people they've beaten and I say, were they in their prime when this happened? And that can cut both ways. Sometimes they're pre-prime. Sometimes you get a win very early in someone's career when they're still very young, they're still on the come up. And it's that wasn't them at their best. They hadn't become the fighter they were going to be yet. But more typically, we're talking about wins post-prime, when the person's aged out of their prime. And when we see that happen, what we do is we say, okay, that win doesn't count for as much as it would have if that person were still in their prime. Now, I've gotten pushback for this on different videos I've made because I often argue people are past their prime. And a great example, one of the more controversial ones I've argued, is that Charles Oliveira was past his prime when Islam Makhachev beat him. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of why just yet, because I'm going to explain what kind of my criteria is for someone being past their prime. But I think people often hear that, and what they think I'm saying is that Charles was washed and that win doesn't count for much for Islam. That's not what I'm saying, because your prime years are your best years. It's not your absolute best moment or best performance, because that's, going to happen in one fight, but it's your best run. It's your best stretch of time. It's the part of your career where you're still young enough, but your body's matured enough. You're strong, you're still athletic, you're young, but you've got experience, you've got your skills are nearly as good as they'll ever be. And all these things are coming together to produce the best version of yourself that you're ever going to be. And that lasts for, usually a few years. And when you age out of that, when you're no longer in your prime, that doesn't mean you suck. That doesn't mean you're completely washed. It just means that you're not at your very best anymore. And typically, people don't just immediately fall off a cliff and just go from being at their very best to being dog shit. It's a gradual decline. And so, when Islam Makhachev beats Charles Oliveira, even though I'd argue he's past his prime, that's still a fantastic win. Charles Oliveira was still clearly the second best lightweight in the world. And whoever the second best lightweight in the world is, whether they're past prime or not, if they're the second best, then beating them counts for a lot. Even Ilia Topuria beat an even older, even more past his prime Charles Oliveira. Oliveira is still one of the top lightweights. He's not quite where he was maybe when Islam beat him, but that's still a very good win for Topuria. It's just not quite as good as the name suggests. If you just looked at his resume years from now and you're like, oh wow, he knocked out Charles Oliveira in round one, you'd have to then look at it and be like, yeah, but at what point in his career was Charles Oliveira? Okay. So for me, the things I look for as far as what someone's prime is and why they should be past it, there's several things. And typically, I won't just look at one of these things. It's if two or more of these things are true. One thing I look at is just their age. Typically what I've seen, at least in the past, and this I'm going to explore this more later on in the video because people's primes do seem to be lengthening a bit. But in the past, 33 was a good safe number for when you should expect people to decline. And two great examples of that are Fedor Emelianenko and Tony Ferguson. Both those guys clearly had their best performances when they were about 32, because Fedor's clear peak was the Tim Sylvia win, and Tony Ferguson's clear peak was the RDA win. And then they both went on to beat a couple more guys, but they were easier competition, especially for Ferguson, but they were easier competition, and the guy in question looked worse with each win. So Fedor beats Tim Sylvia, he then beats Andrei Arlovsky, and then he beats Brett Rogers, but he looks worse in each fight. He's still winning, he's still finishing these guys, but he looks worse each time. Same with Ferguson. He beats RDA, then he beats Kevin Lee, Anthony Pettis, and Donald Cerrone, and those are easier fights each time, and yet Ferguson is looking worse with each win. And so that's sort of signaling to you, like, okay, he's still on this big win streak. He hasn't lost yet, but the loss is coming. And it's signaling to you he's not at his best anymore. And so to see someone lose at age 33, 34, pretty common. And I don't just have like a million statistics here to list off for you, but if you just watch the sport and you look at people's careers, this is a common point where they start falling off. This is a common point where they start losing their belts and things like that. Now, you can't just look at the age, though. Another thing you got to look at is like how many fights they've had. And a big thing is if they've had like well over 30 fights. And if they've had like more than that, then definitely. Like if they've had more than 30, or excuse me, if they've had more than 40 or 50 fights, like realistically, they're probably not in their fucking prime anymore. Like, you know, even if they're young, like even if they're like 31, if they've had 50 fights, they're probably not in their prime. And they're probably almost certain, and even if they somehow are, they're almost certainly not going to be the guy whose prime lasts well past 32. The guy whose prime lasts maybe 33, 34, 35. Like someone with that many fights is not going to have that kind of longevity typically. And on top of that, you got to look at the damage they take in their fights, because that is not equal. And people don't just take damage in their fights, but they take damage in their gyms. Like some gyms, like Shoot a Box, were famous for having gym wars, for having hard sparring on the regular. And if you just know that about someone, like Wanderlei Silva, like if you just know, not only does he have shitloads of fights, and not only has he been in some wars, but you just know he's taking all of this damage in the training room, like you shouldn't expect him to have a really long prime. You shouldn't expect him to still be his best when he's 35. And of course he wasn't. So that's another thing to look at. If you know things about like injuries, because some great fighters, they just fall off because they have some, you know, very terrible injury. Another thing is like what their style is, because some styles age more poorly than others. You know, if you're relying on your speed, on your reflexes, that's going to age poorly. If you're relying on wrestling and endurance, this is where Merab is such an interesting case. In so many ways, he's an anomaly. But I'm curious to see like what his peak will be, or when he'll start obviously declining, because he has a style where you would assume once he starts declining, he's going to decline really fast. You know, if he starts getting injured, or if he just starts getting old enough that he's like, yeah, I'm slower now, I can't push as hard anymore, like I can't just use my endurance and my pace to break these people the way I used to, like that's going to fall off a cliff pretty quickly. So we'll see what happens with him. But that's like the sort of thing, you know, just like at Cain Velasquez, it's a mix of all these things. He had the bad injuries. By a mix of all these things, I mean the last couple things I said. Like, he had the bad injuries. He had a style, a wrestling style, which is prone to injury. You know, wrestlers get hurt early. Their backs, their knees, their necks, all that stuff gets fucked up quicker than, say, like boxers do. And he was a guy who would push a pace. So once you're starting to slow down, you're starting to get hurt, like you just can't push that pace anymore. And bing, bang, boom, like he has this very short-lived time on top. And he becomes like a great what if in the history of the sport. So that's something I look at. Another thing is like, did they have a whole competitive career before MMA, you know, in a different combat sport? And that could be anything. It could, you know, it's especially the case if it's like a striking sport like kickboxing where they're taking damage. You know, you've got to consider like, yeah, this guy's been sparring. He's been getting knocked out in fights. He's had 40 fights or something already before he even started MMA. Like, you just can't expect his prime in MMA to be as long as it would be otherwise. But that applies to other things too. Like even jiu-jitsu, which of all the things to like compete in prior to MMA, it's probably the least damaging. But anyone who's trained jiu-jitsu knows it's just very hard on the body. And so, and what that means is like a guy can maybe only have 20 MMA fights, but you know, maybe he's already 33, 34, and he had a whole competitive career in jiu-jitsu. It's like, yeah, this guy's probably not in his fucking prime anymore. See what I'm saying? Now, the more interesting topic, and kind of what I more want to focus on in this video, is why people's primes appear to be lengthening. Why people seem to be aging more gracefully than they used to in this sport. Because, again, like I said, like 33, it tends to be where the cutoff is. Sometimes it's earlier, like just like at Nogueira. Nogueira was 32 when he came to the UFC and he lost to Frank Mir. He had the fight with Randy Couture, which he won, but like everyone knew both he and Couture were past it, and Couture was older than him, of course, but like people already knew Nogueira wasn't at his best at that point. And you could say, like, how was he past his prime? He was only 32. It's like, yeah, but he'd had nearly 40 fights. He had taken shitloads of damage. He'd had a competitive jiu-jitsu career before he did MMA. And he just did stuff in the old days that we don't do anymore. Okay? Like, he fought Bob Sapp 20 days after he fought someone else. And if you know about the Bob Sapp fight, you know that Nogueira took just ungodly amounts of damage in that fight. He won, but that's like one of the worst brutal beatings you'll see in a fight, especially from a guy who still wins. And again, he fought 20 days prior to that. So he wins a fight, and like a week later, they're like, hey, you want to fight Bob Sapp in 10 days? And he's like, sure. And then boom, that's what happens. And a year prior to that, he had won a rings tournament where he had to fight 3 times in one night. Okay, like doing that kind of shit is going to shorten your fucking prime. Like current modern fighters don't do that stuff typically. Maybe if they're fighting in Japan or something, but then they're also like not at their best. Like Nogueira was the best heavyweight in the world when he was doing that shit. So if that's how you roll, like you're just going to age out more quickly, and that's all well and good, but I think the thing people most overlook, or the two things rather that people most overlook, and like why people's primes are lengthening, are the fact that the sport is sort of leveling off, and because weight cutting is kind of maxed out. Because what people typically look at, like when I hear people talk about this topic, and when they talk about like why people's careers are lasting longer, they overwhelmingly look at the training. They say, oh, the nutrition is better. People aren't killing themselves with their strength and conditioning as much as they used to, because guys just used to just day after day just grind out these intense workouts, like how Rich Franklin used to train. And it was less scientific, and it was less built around like peaking you, and more just built around just going through hell day after day. And people talk about the gym wars. They talk, like I said earlier, with Wanderlei Silva and Chute Boxe, like guys used to just take so much damage sparring. And now with people like Max Holloway and others talking about how much light sparring they do, as opposed to how much, more hard sparring they used to do in the past, like, that makes sense that would help lengthen your career. And I think that's all true. And I think that's a contributing factor, but I think that's much less important than the weight cutting and just the way the sport is sort of plateaued in terms of skill. Because if you think about it, like in the past, fighters were much smaller relative to their weight classes. And we just have seen guys get dwarfed by next generation fighters. So like, for example, look at John Jones's run. When he won the belt off Shogun and then subsequently defended it the first few times, he was fighting light heavyweights who should have been middleweights, and in some cases probably should have been welterweights, by modern standards, by modern weight cutting standards. Shogun Rua, Quentin Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans, the last two of which just did go down to middleweight at one point, or at some point. Those guys were just not modern light heavyweights in terms of their size, in terms of how much weight they cut. And to have someone like John Jones, who's not only huge and you can't ever imagine making middleweight, but who is huge and skilled, like it was just, they just kind of aged out of their division because they no longer could hang in terms of the size. And granted, some of those guys did stick around, and Shogun, still had wins after that, and was like, it's more of an indictment on light heavyweight, but like Shogun remained a top 15 guy for many years to come. But nevertheless, like you just look at the size of these people. You look at your Rakiches, you look at, Jones, of course, you look at Gustafsson, you look at Teixeira, you look at Alex Pereira. Like these are just very big dudes. And guys like Shogun, guys like Machida, they're just not big enough to fight in that division realistically. And we saw that happen, in the 2000s and the 2010s, we saw the weight cutting get more and more aggressive, you know. And another great example is George St. Pierre. Like when he fought Johnny Hendricks and very narrowly won, very controversially won, you saw him basically learn, like, dude, you are a lightweight. You know, you are a modern day lightweight. Like I've heard people say, like George St. Pierre and Khabib Nurmagomedov are just basically the same size, and Johnny Hendricks is a big welterweight, and he looked a full weight class bigger than George in their fight. And this is pre-USADA, of course, and he was, you know, juicing and everything, and you could see the strength and everything. But just in terms of pure size, like you could see, you know, George just sort of being pushed out of the division. And that's just not a thing fighters really have to worry about anymore. I mean, fighters still have to figure out what's their best weight class and everything. But I think we've approached the limit for how much weight people can realistically cut. I think the practices and the standards have now been so optimized that it's just not realistic Islam Makhachev could ever make 145, for example. It's not realistic that Kamaru Usman could ever make 155, for example. You know what I mean? Like, it's not realistic that... what's a good one? It's not realistic that, you know, the light heavyweights are listed. Like Alexander Rakic is not making middleweight. You know, it's just not happening. And so that's just a thing now. If you're a champion, if you're Alexander Volkanovski, you just don't need to worry about that. You just don't need to worry like, oh shit, I just won the belt and I'm going to be a great champion. But like 4 years from now, everyone's going to be a whole fucking division bigger all of a sudden, and I need to deal with that. You know, that's just not a problem. And the other thing is the skill development. Like, the sport was still coming into its own all the way into the 2010s. You know, like, people were, of course, originally in the very early days, it was just style versus style. But even when people started cross-training, it took a long time. Like, it took time for people to become well-rounded. Like, cross-training used to just mean, like, oh, I'm a jiu-jitsu guy and I'm going to go train boxing too. Like, that was cross-training. And well-rounded used to mean, the standard for what well-rounded meant was a lot lower back in the Eric Paulson, Frank Shamrock days than it is now. And on top of that, just most people weren't well-rounded back then. And the things that make the sport what it is, the unique things of like striking into your takedowns, using the fence, using the ground and pound, things that you don't get from the composite arts of like wrestling and boxing and jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai and whatnot, like those sorts of things were still getting figured out. And so you saw guys just sort of who maybe in like 2003 represented the highest level of skill in the sport. You saw the sport catch up and then pass them by, you know? So you'd have someone become a champion in 2003, but by the time 2010 comes around, they're just a fossil, you know? They're just old news in terms of their skills. And I don't really think that happens anymore. Like, I think the meta still changes, you know, and certain points of emphasis and what becomes strategically optimal will still change, and adaptations are still happening. And we see that with like the Dagestanis, and now we're seeing with some of the new anti-wrestling approaches coming out, you know, kind of counters to the Dagestani approach. And that's going to always happen. You know, that happens in every sport. But that's more of like, you know, that's more of like sort of optimizing your build. But in terms of just the skill level as a whole, just rising categorically the way it used to, I think we're largely past that. I think it's more like an asymptote where it's like you expect a quick rise early and then it starts leveling off, and then it rises less and less and less over time as it like slowly approaches its hypothetical limit. Like, I think we're more, that's how something like this is going to look. And not unlike with a sport like boxing, where it's not like year to year boxing is just getting better and better and better. You know, maybe the norms and the meta change, but again, that's more just kind of shifting where you put your stats. That's not the whole thing leveling up across the board, you know, in these huge leaps the way it used to. So, with this all said, with the smarter dieting, the smarter training and whatnot, and more importantly, with weight cutting kind of being maxed out at the moment, and with the overall skill level kind of stagnating or improving much, much, much slower than it used to, as it approaches its, theoretical limit. Like, with those things happening, you can become a champion now, and you just don't need to be that afraid that 6 years from now the sport is just going to be radically different, where everyone is suddenly a million times better and twice the size of you. That's just not a thing you have to fucking realistically worry about anymore. And so, this is also a way for me to kind of say, like, this does make me rethink a little bit how I assess people's primes, because on the one hand, I still kind of stick to what I've said. I still think that, you can still look at maybe not their age, maybe that's the thing that's like the least reliable now, but if they've been fighting, if they've had 40 fights and they've taken shitloads of damage, and if they had a whole combat career before this, or they've had really bad injuries, like, they're still probably not in their prime. But on the flip side, the fact that, you can become a champion early, maybe have a style that will age well, maybe have not yet taken tons of damage, like, it might be realistic for some of these champs to be around for a long time. And I made a video the other day about Tom Aspinall's prospects and some other fighters' prospects on that front. And, maybe we don't need to be as conservative with some of these estimates as we used to, or as we have been in recent years, rather. That's just sort of my two thoughts on that. There's still other things I didn't even cover that, like, go into how I look at someone's prime. So, like, I look at, like, have they been fighting for well over 10 years? How long have they been fighting at the elite level? Like, it's one thing to be fighting for 12 years, but it's another thing to be fighting in the UFC for 10 of those 12 years. See what I'm saying? There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, and you kind of take this all in when you look at a fighter, and you just sort of look at how they're doing. Because even just fighting that long, and especially at the elite level where that pressure's on you, like, people get burnt out. You know what I mean? Like it might be a thing where it's like, well, this guy's he's only 32. He's only had like 29 fights. He's been fighting for 11 years. He's not taking, he's been knocked out once, but he's not taking that much damage. And it's like, yeah, but he's been in the UFC since he was 21, and some of his fights, especially recently, he just kind of looks lethargic. He just kind of looks disinterested. He looks like he's getting fucking burnt out on this shit. You know what I mean? And maybe that means he can turn it around because physically he's still there, but, like, that's a thing too. Mental burnout is a part of it. And so, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, I guess would be maybe the most salient takeaway from all this. But that's just what I wanted to say. I want to explain what I mean by a prime, how I look at people's primes, and sort of why we can maybe expect primes to continue to lengthen or to be longer now than they were maybe, 10 years ago, and what those big factors are that I think are contributing to that everyone else is missing, which again are the fact that weight cutting is basically maxed out and the overall skill level just isn't improving that much year to year anymore. Okay, so that's all I got.